Hey everyone, this is Stephen from Superna. I'm just going to wait a couple minutes here to allow others to join, and Andrew will be on shortly to present. Thanks everyone for joining. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, just pop them into the chat. I'll be monitoring it, and we'll do our best to answer anything that comes up during the call. And for anyone that needs to exit early and wants to see the recording, we'll be posting it to our YouTube page later on today.
Thanks, Stephen. You should be able to hear me, right? Just want to double check the audio. Okay.
No problem. I will end my screen share and we can present.
Okay, perfect. This is 2 minutes after. We'll go ahead and get started. We get a lot of questions, especially with the introduction of release 257, which was a major release for Ransomware Defender. So we would go through sort of best practices and cover some of the new things that are coming, and talk about Cyber Vault AirGap as well. And that's a pretty popular topic these days. So let me share a set of slides. Once I can find them. All right, hey there. All right, so this release is release 257. We made a lot of changes, all of them aimed at automation and simplifying, but we get a lot of questions on how best to monitor and configure. And we had a number of questions around the various lists that we have. So there's an ignore list, there's a monitor list. So we'll go through those, what they're for, and there's some more advanced use cases that we'll touch on as well. But we'll start with the main change, or the biggest change that we've made to this release, which is what we call learning mode. And learning mode is designed to basically configure the product. It's typically turned on, and we'll go through how it's turned on, but it's turned on after installation, but it can also be turned on at any time. And its purpose is to look at detections that are seen in the environment, and it is typically done in monitor mode, which means you're not enforcing, there'll be no lockouts of users, and it will look at the active events over the period of 30 minutes. So you'll see an active event, it'll sit there, it's supposed to sit there. You should not flag it as false positive. That was the previous release. In this release, you just leave it, it'll do it on its own. And what it's doing is it's waiting for 30 minutes once an event's been raised, because there could be additional, we call them signals, and we'll go through the definitions of those in a second, but there could be additional files that are continue to be touched or added during that 30 minutes. So it needs to see all that information and then look at it over the period of 30 minutes. And when it's done that, it will then customize the settings for that individual user. The logic that's used in monitor mode is different than the flag is false positive option. They're not the same thing. So if you're in learning mode and you flag something as false positive, you're essentially skipping learning mode completely. And you can do that. I mean, nothing wrong with doing it, but you're not allowing it to analyze the 30-minute period. You're sort of cutting it short. So maybe we'll start with some definitions. We have thresholds, and generally, should they be changed or tuned? Not really. We would still request asking support. They'll identify when they should be changed. In general, learning mode is what is going to customize the settings for each environment. There are scenarios where we would ask that the thresholds be changed, but it's not that often. And we generally let learning mode do what it's supposed to. We refer to signals in the user interface, and a signal does not equal a file. That's important. A signal is essentially a behavior, and a behavior could be renaming files, it could be deleting files. There's a number of behaviors, but essentially a signal is a collection of files that were touched in a particular way, and it's not a fixed number. So, one signal is not 20 files. It varies, and it depends on the behavior that we're talking about. So we get that question a lot. There's no correlation at all. And a signal, the more of them, the higher the count. It basically means the longer the behavior was occurring. That's really what it means. And if a behavior is continuing, and then the longer it continues, then that adds to the signal count. That does add to when an action would be taken against that user. So that's that warning, major, or critical threshold. The more signals, the more likely a lockout is going to occur, and a particular user can trigger more than one behavior. And it is visible in the user interface, but essentially we get a lot of questions in this area. So summary is, a signal is not a file. A signal could be what's the range? Anywhere from 10 to 30 files. It depends on the detection of the pattern that we're looking for. And the higher the signal count, the longer that behavior was going on, and the more likelihood that it's going to increase the actions taken against that particular user. I'll go to user interface and explain where this is all visible. So those are some of the definitions. We can provide these slides as well. They're a good reference. So if we go back to learning mode, maybe I'll switch to the user interface here. So no active events at the moment. Oh, actually, there's one. So the signals are here. And if I mouse over it, it says warning, major, and critical. So it's counting the number of warning signals, then the ones that end up in the major category, and then the number that ends up in the critical. And that maps directly to the thresholds here. So warning, major, and critical. So yes, you can click on these. We do get asked about these quite a bit. There are a number of pattern detectors. We do add some new ones, on various releases. And there were some new ones added. There are some new ones going to be added in an upcoming release as well. These, are not published. For those that have opened cases or asked that question, these are not published for a few reasons. The first is actually, describing what this pattern is anywhere online publicly would allow somebody to try to figure out how to avoid that pattern. So that's a reason that we don't have these detailed anywhere. But so what are patterns? I mean, we can talk about them at a high level. A pattern that looks like ransomware, when you boil ransomware down to audit data, it has to read files, no choice, right? Can't encrypt them if you don't read them. Usually the cipher encryptions, happening on the client, the server, or the Windows machine, or could be Linux. And then it's going to have to write that data back to the cluster, and it can either overwrite the file. That's one option. Then it would typically rename that file. I'll explain why in a second. Or it could create a new file, .encrypt or something, or .locky, and then it could delete the original unencrypted file. And there's a few other permutations of how that gets done. It might change the name of the file. It might hash the name of the file. But typically, they just rename them, and I'll explain why. And why that's such a common method is that when ransomware encrypts a file, obviously it's with a key, and the decryption process, if you were to get the decryption key, then it applies the encryption algorithm, whichever one it is, doesn't really matter. AES, could, Blowfish, whatever, it doesn't matter. When you apply that decryption process, it just runs the encryption in reverse with the decryption key. It's symmetric encryption. So if you were to take a file that was never encrypted and run it through the decryption process, what would happen is you'd basically corrupt the file. You'd scramble the data, right? Because the decryption process doesn't actually care what the data is. It just runs the algorithm against it with the decryption key. So obviously, when a malware encrypts maybe tens or thousands of files, they don't keep track of it, right? They're not keeping track of what they encrypted or what they didn't encrypt. So they actually do need a way, that the bad guys need a way to guarantee that if they give you the decryption key, that they don't apply or don't have you decrypt data that was never encrypted, because you'd corrupt it. And obviously then, you'd be pretty angry if their decryption process was so dumb that it actually encrypted or corrupted data that was never attacked in the first place. And that's why the extension approach solves that problem, right? They'll never allow their decryption tools to run against a file unless it has the extension that they set. So that's why the extension is such a common method for the bad guys. And it's common enough that, you can see of all the strains of ransomware that have existed, this is not a fully exhaustive list, but you can see that it's pretty common, because here's a list of, a lot of the extensions that have been seen in the field. And we'll talk about this list as well, and how this is maintained. So go back to active events. These are generally, this number, the higher it is, the more likely this will turn into a critical event. Only critical events have an instant lockout. Anything that's in the major category has a timed lockout. So we'll go through that in a second. But that's sort of a definition of what this means. Higher number, longer pattern. So if we go over to the thresholds, we did add something new here, and it's for the warning scenario, and we call it a dual vector detector, because it's using the signal strength, which we just talked about, as criteria, so 3 or higher, an interval, and that it's analyzing over, and then a minimum user duration. So this can actually be customized. And we've set a default. This actually is not the default in this environment normally, but you can add additional variations here. What it's really doing is it's analyzing over a period of time, and it's going to use 2 sets of criteria to determine if that behavior is suspicious or not. And it's essentially able to look at lower rate encryption scenarios and pick them up. That's really why it was added. So if something's not encrypting at a high rate, then this detector would pick that up. We have the ability to add more here, and we may choose to do that. But for those that have upgraded to 257, this was likely to find detections that the previous release did not, which is why when we upgrade, we generally want to turn on learning mode, and that's right here. So that's on and that's off. when you're in learning mode, is the file system protected? Yes, because we're still detecting, we're still alerting, and we're still snapshotting. We're just not locking out the user. So ultimately, the snapshot, if you were in learning mode and ransomware hit, you're still going to have a snapshot. And of course, the lockout doesn't happen, but ultimately your data recovery option is the tracking of the individual files and the snapshot. So it's not, you're not in a state where you're not protecting the file system. Obviously, you're not going to lock out, but in reality, if you actually had ransomware and you went in, you will know about it at some point, right? It's unlikely you would never become aware of it. And so you'll have the snapshots, you'll have the list of users. So that's all still going to be retained. So how long does learning mode need to be on? We would suggest over the course of normal workflow days. So in some environments, every workflow happens every day. In some environments, I don't know, particular jobs or server applications do things on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Essentially, it's unique to each environment, but you'll know what to do with learning mode. And the reason it's fairly straightforward is when this is on, you will see events appearing here. And as I mentioned, you leave them alone 30 minutes, they'll disappear all by themselves because learning mode waits for 30 minutes and then says, okay, I'll analyze that event and I'll archive it. And it moves it to the history tab. If you're in learning mode and on a given day, nothing shows up, it's an indication that all the behaviors that were seen that day have been seen before. And so that's the number one way to know, okay, when can I exit learning mode? Well, if I'm not getting any new active events, then that's the number one criteria to decide I want to enter enforcement mode. So let's just take a look at how you would do that. So if I was in this mode, I'll just put it in the mode that you'd normally be in. So you'd be like this: critical, learning mode on, and monitor mode. No more events showing up, then you would do that, you would do that, and then click submit, and that's it. And now you'd be in enforcement mode.
Sorry, we have a question from Michael here. So can enforcement mode be enabled during learning mode so that it would create a lockout while still in learning mode, or are they independent, exclusive?
Yeah, so we do have a hybrid mode, and that'll lead me to the lists. So what did we have in 256 in earlier? So if I go there, we had this list, and you could enter a path, and you can do this kind of thing, home dir. So that's a wild card for whatever folder name is there. And then, you can do star and so on. So you could add ignore lists. Ignore lists literally saw events that match that criteria and just skip them. It's just not even going to look at the user behaviors on that. It's a drop event. Same thing here. If I add the user here, app one, it's going to see all IO from that app one user and just ignore it. And then this is the server IP. What we added was a new list called monitor only settings. And you'll notice we had a bulk conversion. So we're generally recommending whatever you had listed here, just convert it over to this list. So there's a button that made that simple. But what is this list doing? So it looks the same. So what's the difference? In this, what it's really doing is it turns off instant lockout for any behavior that matches any one of these three input boxes: user, path, or IP. And this would typically be recommended for server-based applications where you want them monitored. You want to know if there's bad behaviors, and you do want snapshotting, but you just don't want it locked out. It could be a critical application and you just don't want to see that application services can get locked out, but you still want protection, you still want monitoring. So you'll add it to this list. Most commonly, it would be something here app 1 would be added here. But it can be path-based or server IP-based as well. So when you're on this mode or in anything on this list, it's not going to get locked out, right? By design, that's the purpose. So what happens if I did this? So I'm in enforcement mode and I'm learning. What's happening in this configuration? What's happening is anything on this list here, we will be learning. So let's say it's a server application and it's still generating a detection. And you would like to learn and get rid of the alerts that are showing up. You want to suppress those. But I also want to be enforcing everywhere else in the file system. And that's what this setting would do. So this is going to enforce everywhere except for what's listed here. And if learning mode's on, then any behavior that matches any of these filter boxes will still be learned. So you can be in enforcement mode and learning for anything on this list at the same time. And that would be when, for instance, you deploy a new application, brand new application. It's a service account, so it's going to log in. Brand new application, we would recommend you add, call it app 2. You add app 2 user to the list, and then you'd go and turn on learning mode, because that new application, you don't know. I mean, some applications are fine, like many applications are fine. It's kind of a, it's not a common thing to have an application do an IO pattern that looks like ransomware. But if it's a new application and you don't know what it's going to do, then put it on the monitor mode list and turn on learning mode, and then let it learn about that new application workload. And how do you know if everything's okay? Simply look for active events for that account. If nothing shows up here and learning mode's on and the application's doing its thing, it's reading, writing, whatever it's doing to the file system, and let that application run for a day, maybe 2 days, and nothing shows up for that new application, no app 2 user shows up, then essentially that application behavior is fine, right? If it isn't fine, then it would show up as an alert, but it won't lock it out, and then it will learn it. And then you would leave it until no new active events. That's how you know the learning's done, is just leave it on there. And remember, each 30 minutes, if you get an alert here, 30 minutes goes by, it gets rid of the event and it goes to the history. Let's call that learning phase 1. So it learned one time about that application. So application's still doing its thing. It's possible that application shows up again, but that's okay. It just means it's now going to take the settings for that behavior for app 2, and it's going to learn again. So it's perfectly fine to let something learn in multiple cycles or phases. That's normal and that's okay. Ultimately, eventually, app 2 would stop showing up. And that's sort of an extreme scenario. But if that was to happen, perfectly fine. Just let it learn. 30 minutes goes by, it gets rid of it. If it shows up again, another 30 minutes goes by, it'll learn it, and so on, until eventually it just won't show up again. And that's how you're going to know that new application workload has been learned. And at that point, you'd have the option of unselecting this and hitting submit, because you don't need to be in learning mode anymore. So that's how the hybrid mode works. It is in documentation, but it's pretty straightforward. Learn everything on the monitor list, or do this, and now I'm learning on the entire file system. That's really a way to look at this. Entire file system learning, or like that, right here, then I'm only learning for items on this list. That's it. So it's fairly straightforward. Other things we've added, because they're in here, we always debate, do we add this to the UI or not? So we added this. It's advanced settings. We don't recommend changing these or touching these. And so far, we've not made any changes to any of these for any customer in any deployment. We did put it in here as a convenience. So if we ever wanted to make a change, then it's easy to direct someone to do it. There's no editing of files or anything. So this is basically for support. There's no reason really to be in here. It is here. We really debated, do we do this or not? But we did want a way to make it simple. If we ever had to ask a customer to make a change, then you just come in here and make a change. So you should really never be here. You should never be here or here.
Do we have a list for what each of those threat detector levels means? Can we publish that?
Well, the list of the actual detectors, this is actually the list. So there's 17 of them. What each one does, as I sort of said up front, we don't publish these behaviors in any real detail, because this would give this would give the bad guys everything they need to know to evade the behavior. Like literally, they would have a recipe on how to do it. So that's a reason why we would not be publishing the detailed specifics of what these are looking for. But I think I said up front, maybe joined later, essentially, ransomware is reading and encrypting data, and then either renaming, deleting data, and permutations of that workflow. So there's definitely renaming and deleting type logic in here, but it is also combined with reading, right? We have a lot of customers that try to test their environment, and we have testing procedures, but what we find is that you just can't copy data to a share. If you're going to encrypt it, then you actually have to read the file, because we are looking to see that the file was actually read. We know when it was read, we know when it was written to. So in trying to kind of simulate, or for testing purposes, we have guides on how to do that.
And I see some that are disabled there.
Yeah.
Some, or the other question, why would you disable and enable others?
We've set some to disabled, and they're in the product, but we disabled them because they're similar to one that we already have, and we chose not to enable it, or it's in the product and we're determining when we're going to enable it in a particular release. So a particular release will take some of these and enable them when we're ready to do that. So there's definitely some behaviors there that aren't active, and that's sort of by design. We kind of roll them out. We collect log data, and then it helps us understand when or if we should enable a behavior that's already designed into the product. And we need to see behavioral data from the field before we can make that decision. So that's why some of them are developed, but not yet on. So I did see another question, enforcement with critical on. So critical mode is if the signal count, remember signals are a bunch of patterns, and a pattern is a bunch of files. Something happened to a bunch of files. Critical mode is when the number of signals crosses, and I'm in a demo lab, so this, you never want to do this, but this, if you get the signal count to the value here, then it's going to lock out immediately, and it's not going to wait, just going to do it. In some environments, if you do that, you're now disabling this. So this no longer is going to happen. And instead, you get the next highest level, which is major, and it's a timed lockout. So you're still going to get a lockout, but it's after X minutes. So when would you use this? You would use this if you have a 24-hour SOC and someone is able to react and review something and make a decision on it, because up until the countdown timer, so it starts at 30 minutes, 29, 28, when it hits 0, it's going to lock the user out, but it gives you a window of time for someone to evaluate the event, and you can cancel the lockout. I don't have an active event, but from the actions menu, you can cancel the lockout. So it really just adds a buffer, and that buffer is designed for a person to be able to respond and then make a decision. So that's really the purpose of disabling critical. Ultimately, if you don't have the ability to review events 7 by 24 hour, then, middle of the night, there's all you're really doing if you did this and you have no way to review the event is you're allowing, let's say it was 30 minutes. What you're really doing is saying, well, I'll let ransomware run amok for 30 minutes and then it will lock out. And all that does is just makes more data get encrypted. So it's really designed around a workflow where you've got a person who's able to review and respond and make a decision and cancel lockouts. So that's the purpose of the critical mode off. So I wanted to sort of finish off the lists use case. So ignored now, not a lot of good reasons to use it. You may have some, for instance, you may have an application generating a lot of transitory data. And if that application would trigger an alert, and the data is who cares? Like, let's call it scratch data. It's some data that gets created, deleted, created, deleted. It's just like a build process. Actually, a build process is a good example. Compiling software, not that everyone's doing that, but if you were to do a build process, you can always rebuild. Do I want to worry about temporary data? Not really. So that's a number one use case, is scratch data. I'll just, make up some app scratch data here, right? I just don't care. And that's a good use case. And we definitely have customers that have that kind of scenario where the data can be recreated easily. So why protect it, or why deal with alerting? So that's the number one use case for this list now. This is the list where you just don't want lockout to happen, but you want protection. And then everything else is automatically protected based on what you've set up here, which is critical on or off, and snapshots on or off. So snapshots, I want to talk about snapshots and what we're doing here. So snapshots are designed to execute based on the user. The user's AD groups are factored in to assessing if that user has access to 1 share or 10 shares. So it figures out the SMB shares, and then it applies a snapshot to each of those shares. If you've got a lot of shares and you have everyone full control, then the list of shares could be quite big. So that's one scenario. We'll talk about how we're going to handle that. The next scenario is you're basically using ACLs, and it is everyone full control or something similar, granting almost everybody access to all shares. But in reality, users don't have access to all shares because ACLs are protecting the file system. So what we're doing here specifically, and again, this is on or off. I mean, we would never recommend doing this, but you can turn off snapshotting because that's ultimately your number one data protection recovery option. But what we're doing here is we're going to add, number one, a quota of snapshots. So let's say it's 1,000. We will create 1,000 snapshots And when we hit the 1,000 snapshot, then we stop creating new snapshots, because there's a point where more snapshots really doesn't protect your data better. You probably already have existing snapshots that we created that were protecting the file system just fine, right? So we're going to let you enter a quota, and it will monitor the snapshots that we created, ignoring all of the ones you created. And let's say snapshots expire, because our snapshots expire in 48 hours by default. So if, say, 500 snapshot or 100 snapshots of the 1,000 expire, then we are allowed to create 100 more. So that's how it's going to work. It's going to be like a floating level of snapshots based on the expiries. The second thing we're doing is we're going to have what we call a critical path entry box. So it will have 3 options. I'll just pick it'll be similar to this. You'll enter a path. I'll use an example. If someone in their home directory, because generally ransomware enters through a person. If someone in a home directory gets ransomware, and then of course it probably spreads to other PCs, but that particular user, let's just assume that they have access to the home directory and nothing else. But now ransomware is in the environment on that PC, and it's going to try to spread laterally to other PCs. In that configuration, or that scenario, we would snapshot the home directory. So great, we protect all the home directories. But let's assume that cluster has, PAX application or some server-based application, and it has a share, and that share is used by the application, but the users themselves use the application through some web UI or some GUI application. They don't actually have direct access to the SMB share used by the application, right? That's exclusively set up for the application to use. So what we're going to let you enter is, IFS data, whatever, I'm just making it up, app 1. We'll make that a critical path. And you could add app 2 and app 3. I could add a whole bunch of them. What that's going to do is it's going to say, well, if there's a detection and a lockout event, we will create snapshots on the critical paths. Because ultimately, yeah, the home directory data, yes, you want to protect it, but is it as important as the application data? Probably not. So this will then create a snapshot. So a user gets infected, they encrypt data in their home drive. This option would then snapshot app 1, app 2, app 3, or whatever paths that you entered. It's going to create a snapshot wherever you want it. You can enter any path you want. In that mode, we're going to have sort of modes. We're going to say, if there's a detection, only snapshot the critical paths, meaning don't worry about the home directory, just protect the critical paths that I entered. Those are the only paths I care about, app 1, app 2, app 3. Or we're going to have a mode that says, do the normal share lookup and lock out the shares, but also snapshot the critical paths. So you'll be able to toggle what you want. You want the current behavior plus the critical paths, or I only want the critical paths. So how could this be used in the ACL scenario? Well, the ACL scenario is that you have 500 shares and the users have access to all 500 shares. So you probably don't want those 500 snapshots. If one user gets an event, then yeah, it's going to create 500 snapshots. So what you're better off doing is picking the paths that you want snapshots on, and you can still protect the home dir. I mean, you can still do that, and then I could still create app 1 or app 2, but we're just going to stop using the share lookup method. So now you won't get 500 snapshots. You're going to get snapshots on the paths that you decide. And that would be the recommendation if you've got ACL-based security and basically everybody has access to every share. So that's how we're going to sort of address that ACL or everyone full control scenario. And that's coming in update 2 and the quota feature I mentioned. So that's like an update to 257 that's in progress right now. Update 1 is the current most update release. And that is a fairly targeted release. I don't have exact timing, but that's, the next several weeks, we hope to be able to release update 2 and add those 2 new features. They'll probably show up in here. So lists, this is a good sort of segue into lists. So this list, if anyone's played with it, it's a big list. You get a bunch of extensions. This list is a curated list of extensions that are sort of aggregated on the internet of people that have said, well, I got ransomware and this is the extension that it got me with. That's how this list is built. We collect new list data about once a quarter and we filter it out. There's some of them that we just don't want. We get rid of the extensions and then we merge it in. So what we've done in 257 is we now have versioning. So versioning is this list has multiple versions available. And there's a CLI command that you can run to see what version you have and what versions exist. So newer versions of the list. And you can switch from the version of this list to a new list. You can also configure it to just auto switch, which means if we publish new extensions, the product will just pick up the new list. But if you want to have control over that list, then you can run the CLI command to switch to the new list, but you probably want to know what's on the new list. So there's a compare command that will compare 2 versions and it will show you exactly the differences between them. So you'll see what extensions have been added, and from there you decide, okay, I want that list. So that's been enhanced greatly. The other thing that we did in this release is the list used to require the ECA VMs to get to the internet. That's gone. Now it's just the iGlass VM. So we moved the list ingestion functions to iGlass itself because it most commonly had a proxy or firewall rules to allow it to reach the internet. So that was a big change as well. It simplified everything. So now iGlass gets the list itself. And if you've allowed a proxy or direct firewall access out to the internet, it'll be able to pick up that list. Also new in this list, and you'll see it says built in. So these are ours, but you can add your own. So if there's an extension that you'd like to ban, no problem. Just enter it as the example. But be careful because, that works. That would ban every Word doc, so, maybe that's more likely, or MOV, but it will work, and, use with caution because it will lock out users that use those types of files. 3 settings: enforcement of that extension, disable it, meaning I don't want that extension active right now. And then monitor mode, and that's just what it sounds like. That monitor mode setting says, if you see detections with MOV in it, I just want to know, give me an alert, give me the list of files, give me the username, give me all the usual stuff, but don't lock out. So in a sort of backwards way, if you're curious who's using MOV files, you could do what I'm doing. Not going to lock them out, but it's going to kind of tell you if anybody's messing around with MOV files. Not really why we developed it, but you could do that. Just figure out if a certain app is actually being used anywhere in your file system. But the other better use case is, you read about some bad malware thing that you'd like to protect yourself from. So then just go ahead and add it, bad app. So this is also a great way to test. You can make up your own extensions as well. My extension, my test. And that's actually in our documentation, how to test. So it's a big list. And of course, you're going to want to filter it. So you want to filter it based on the ones that you created or ours or both. And then the same thing here. It's like, well, I don't remember what I disabled, so that's fine. Just filter it. So that's really what this, this helps out with. So that's sort of a major overhaul of the list management stuff. So we've touched on a lot of the best practices here. Like I said, if you're in monitor mode, you do have to come in here and filter on disabled, because if there's a detection in learning mode, it's going to set it to disabled. And so you'll want to review that list. So you'd filter this list down, you'd filter it to disabled only. And then you'd review those extensions, because that means the extensions used in your environment. And if you're okay with it, then do nothing, just leave it alone, nothing to do. But that's how learning mode works with the file extensions. It just flips them to disabled, and you have to go in here and look to go see what it did. I don't have any learn thresholds, but everything that it's learned, it's all here. You can, I have to think, is this in 258 or not? So you can search, because this list can get big. So it lists the user, the SID for the user, and basically a learning multiplier that we use internally in code to treat that behavior. But essentially, this is where it learns everything, so you can actually see what it's doing. So that's probably covers pretty well the sort of best practices. We have guides that sort of highlight all of this as well. With the time remaining, wanted to cover some of the, what's coming or what's new. But I see there is a question here. Yeah, so we are planning, let me just get into the notification center. So here is it here? Here we go. We can add a recipient, and we do have different ways to filter what gets emailed to who. This is obviously everything. We do plan to add Ransomware Defender to this list. So we will be adding that here. Don't know if it's going to make update 2, but yes, we are going to add that to this list. And that'll probably help a lot of folks out, because that's, number one request for sure, to simplify that process. And yes, learn thresholds are customized to a person. They're unique to the user that was executing that behavior. That's why it lists the user in the security identifier here. So I touched on some things coming in update 2. In terms of entire product, what you've been looking at actually is 258. And 258 will include support for ECS. So for anyone that's got object storage, you notice all of these are interfaces said Isilon or ECS, and it says bucket path to object. So this version that I'm looking at now is the object aware version, and here's an object user, so object admin 1, and you can see here the VDC, the namespace, the bucket, and so on. So we'll have a single pane of glass. Same ECA VMs will ingest audit data through syslog or our syslog feature on ECS, and we'll be able to do the exact same real-time behavior monitoring and lockout. No snapshot on ECS, because there is no snapshotting, but we will be able to disable this user account and all the learning, all the lists, full functionality. That's currently in beta right now, probably about 4 weeks from general availability of the ECS version. So it's going to require its own licenses, but you can see here it's a single pane of glass, file and object, all protected from the same system, and it will include security guard, and security guard, executes against the file system. In an object world, there'll be a user account that will create a pattern of IO in a bucket, and it'll execute the same logic and give you the same sort of reporting, and it'll go through the whole sort of life cycle against an ECS as well. You probably saw a reference to it here. We're also going to have a dynamic bucket versioning feature to protect a bucket that doesn't have versioning on. If we see something attacking it, we'd ultimately be able to turn on bucket versioning as well. So ECS solution available very soon. If there's interest, we certainly have dedicated sessions on that. So not a lot of time left, but it is a big topic, and we've had webinars on it before. Is Cyber Vault. So we have two versions of it. Just get this slide up. Oops. I think I went the wrong way. There we go. AirGap Basic and Enterprise. So what's Basic? You've got a dedicated role and an AirGap management icon that would be used by the security team typically. You're going to get emails on what was replicated into the Cyber Vault. In-band management. So we don't require any sort of backdoor management network to manage the hardware in the vault, because we use an in-band method to collect alarm data while the Cyber Vault replication is occurring. We use that window of time to grab alarms off of the Vault Isilon cluster and forward them out through Eyeglass itself. So that's built in. Schedule management, all done in Ransomware Defender. Smart AirGap, that's the concept of, if my source cluster is under threat and there's an active alarm, I probably shouldn't replicate my data into the vault. So it'll dynamically disable schedules and not replicate if there's an active alarm that requires attention. And networking is a much bigger topic than we have time for here, but it's going to require a layer 3 hop into the vault. So a little private layer 3 hop. And typically, from a scalability standpoint, best suited to protect a single source cluster. The license for this is already in any Ransomware Defender license that you already own. So what are you missing? Well, you're missing the license for the Vault cluster, which is just a standard Eyeglass DR license, for that Vault cluster. Then there's a professional service, but that's it, because every ransomware customer has the AirGap license. So now, what's AirGap Enterprise? It's everything above. It's all these functions. But now it runs as a VM inside the Vault. So it's a new piece of software. And we move into an offline mode where the IP stack is gone. So essentially, it's an Isilon with no IP stack. And in that configuration, you can't ping it, you can't log into it, it's gone. In the basic edition, we're adding and deleting a static route to your production cluster, but the Ethernet networking is up and functional, but there's no route to reach the Vault cluster over a private network. It's still a private network. This goes one step further and now disconnects the entire cluster from the network. It also expands out to supporting fan-in, so multiple source clusters leveraging a flat layer 2 network. And essentially the Vault cluster just disappears and then rejoins the IP network And this would typically be done over a layer 2 stretch type network. And we'll also be integrating smart lock feature to create on some interval, probably monthly, a locked version of the data. Comes at additional disk space, but it will give you additional capabilities to protect the data with a locked version using the smart lock capabilities. And so to kind of show a slide of what this looks like, I'll just skip to that. It looks like this. So this is the vault. There's a new piece of software that sits in here, private little network, to manage this. But the outward facing ports here don't have an IP address. There's no backdoor. There's no way into this environment. So when it's time to replicate, it's all controlled from inside the vault. It adds interfaces to a pool. It's able to tunnel its way all the way out here and ask Ransomware Defender, is it safe to replicate right now? In this case, the example is, yes, it's safe. So what it does is it initiates the SyncIQ replication policies. So that would happen. And then once that's done, it's going to monitor that replication. And when it's completed successfully, it's going to take the whole cluster off the network again. And then the immutability function that I mentioned, that immutability, that would just execute by cloning data to a path and unlocking it. And that would all be running inside here. So 2 different versions of the solution available, basic and enterprise. Lots of conversations around this type of solution with customers. So it's a popular topic. And I should highlight recent changes from large insurance companies are now requiring to qualify for cyber insurance. The requirement is now shifting where you have to demonstrate you have an offline copy of your data. That's either to qualify for insurance or to reduce premiums, depends on the insurance company. But that shift is now happening where it's not a best practice. It's essentially being mandated by insurance companies. So if you're interested to talk about this in more detail, we're happy to set up sessions and go through this in a lot more detail. And I see a question here on API support. Yes, we are adding an API that says, is there a threat or not? And that could be used by us. We're going to use it, but you could use it too. So yes, we are adding that API right now into Eyeglass. So you'll be able to ask that question over the REST API. We have a REST API for a lot of things. We have it for alarms. We have it for failover automation, and we'll just be extending it to include Ransomware Defender. With 1 minute left. If there's any questions, can certainly take those. Quite a bit to cover, but I think we got through most of the key areas. Again, we'll get this posted to our YouTube page, and you can email sales@perna.net, if you want a copy of the slides. Put it in the chat. There's the email address. Yeah, so hopefully this was good. Hopefully this filled in some of the gaps in knowledge around how best to manage and operate the current release 257, and look out for the announcements around update 2, because we think that's going to help in various scenarios that we see quite a bit with customers. And yes, the Vault is another Isilon, probably a longer discussion on Isilon and why, but in 30 seconds, space efficiency with snapshots, speed of replication, and what we call rapid recovery. So the Vault solution that we offer isn't just protecting data, it's going to protect the Isilon. And that's because we can protect the shares and the exports and the data into that Vault. And then you have scalability of recovering into the petabyte range of data in under 2 hours. So if you want a solution that can, in a worst case scenario, bring back petabytes of data with the same shared exports you had in production, then this Cyber Vault solution can do that. And that's sort of one of the key advantages of using an Isilon in this type of architecture. We'll probably end up scheduling another sort of dedicated Cyber Vault session because it's a sort of much bigger topic. And yes, the data domain solution. So yeah, I mean, these are, this is a file optimized solution. You know, obviously we're focused on the file problem, which ultimately, you know, what's ransomware going after? It's going after files. Although a Cyber Vault protects you from more than just ransomware. It's obviously a lot of other threats to your data. Data domain solution is obviously great for VMs and databases and those types of traditional, you know, backup targets. Well, I think we're a little bit over time, but I see a lot stayed on. So we have another session next week, sort of the PST in Asia. And again, we'll likely schedule a Cyber Vault specific session because it's a big topic these days. So thanks everyone for joining. And if you have any questions, you know, sales, of course, if you have the product, you can certainly open a case with support as well. So appreciate the time. Thanks everyone for joining today.